Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today. My name's Jerry Lee Franich, and I'm currently in my final 3 terms of a criminology and criminal justice degree at UNSW. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which each of us currently are joining in from. I'm currently on Camaragal land, and I'm a proud Yuin woman from Ulladulla. I would like to extend that respect to any Indigenous and non-Indigenous person watching today. And I would like to extend that respect to elders past, present, and future who have nurtured and cared for the land that owns them, not them who owns the land. So I will now pass over to Linda Burney MP to just introduce herself.
Thank you, Jerry Lee, for the opportunity to speak with people today. And I'd also like to recognise that I'm on Badigal country, which is around Cogra, and I'm from the Wiradjuri Nation in southwestern New South Wales. So I too join with you in recognising country. Just for everyone that's watching, I'm a Member of Parliament at the moment. I'm the Federal Member for Barton. And I'm also the Shadow Minister for Families and Social Services and the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians. Obviously, as Shadow, I'm clearly in the opposition. I'm a member of the Labor Party, and the responsibility of social services and families is really all the payment systems, a lot to do with aged pensioners, disability support pensioners, lots of work with domestic violence and work in the emergency sector, which has been so important throughout the pandemic in making sure that people stay fed. And obviously the major issues in the portfolio of Indigenous Australians is breathing some life into the Uluru Statement. And of course, the Closing the Gap targets are really important as well.
I'm just a little bit interested in kind of your journey to becoming a member of the House of Representatives.
I have spent most of my career in the education space, both as a teacher, a very long time ago now, but also as an education bureaucrat, as someone working in the non-government sector. I've done lots and lots of things representing Aboriginal people on various boards, both nationally, and I've done a little bit of work internationally. But I've really been a Member of Parliament, not since 2016. That's when I went into the Federal Parliament. And I was very fortunate to be appointed immediately to the front bench. And that had a lot to do with the fact that I'd spent 13 years in the New South Wales Parliament as the member for Canterbury. And I held very senior ministerial positions. And I was also the deputy leader of the Labor Party for the 5 years prior to me leaving in 2015. So it was a pretty tough time for Labor. It's just the immediate aftermath of the disastrous 2012 election. So, I mean, that and a lot of other experiences where the really big decisions are made are in the parliaments of this country. Things that affect your lives in every way are the decisions made by politicians. Democracy is a great thing, and I think the Australian system of democracy is really important. The 3 things that really drove me become a mainstream politician was, and not in any order, the fact that there were very few Aboriginal people in the parliament. There were not enough women, and my entire life had been around the issues of social justice. So I think they were pretty good incentives to stand for Parliament. And I also had the experience of being in touch with the political system. So there was no mystery for me. There was an understanding and personally knowing a lot of politicians through the work that I've done to realise they're just ordinary people with big knowledge gaps just like everybody else.
One of the reasons why you went into Parliament was because of there being a lack of Indigenous women in Parliament. So what types of challenges have you kind of had to grapple with during your career as being an Indigenous female in the House of Representatives?
I have to say that I don't feel that this may sound strange to some people, but I feel that my opinion is very respected. I've been around for a long time. I think that I've got a very proven track record, and I think that I went into the federal parliament at a time where Aboriginality and one's participation was really respected. I've always held a philosophy about being a member of parliament is just because people are on the other side, on a different political party to you, doesn't make them bad people. I've always valued and try and be well mannered. There's no harm in smiling and saying good morning to people. So I feel that what I've had to say has been very respected, and I think, obviously you come up against sexism, which is mostly unintended, and you deal with it. And it's not like I'm young anymore. I've been around long enough to know how to deal with those things. So I feel that my views and my Aboriginality is very respected.
As an MP and someone who is situated in this at the centre of a very process where policy decisions occur, would you be able to offer us some insights into the discourse happening in Parliament in regards to bills, legislation that addresses issues regarding Aboriginal deaths in custody and broadly systematic racism?
Very little. Most of what you're talking about happens in the area of the Attorney Generals and the Shadow Attorney Generals, the lawmakers, if you like. And the Shadow Attorney General on the Labor side's name is Mark Dreyfus. And he is very good at consulting and speaking to the Aboriginal members of the Labor Party and the Aboriginal First Nations caucus that we have. And all the legislation that he deals with comes through that caucus, which is part of the process of the Labor Party before it goes to Shadow Cabinet and then it goes to full caucus. So recently we've dealt with things like native title and where it's things like we've raised issues of deaths in custody, you make private member statements, you speak about it in every opportunity that you can get. So whilst there hasn't been a lot of legislation, we've very much raised these issues within the Parliament. Obviously, recently we've had the government bring down the latest closing the gap targets. One of the things that was pleasing, and it came from many years of lobbying, particularly from the Labor Party, is to have a justice target, which goes to the issue of the number of Aboriginal people in custodial circumstances. We're also arguing very strongly that there should be continued funding for Aboriginal legal services, Aboriginal advocacy bodies. So they're the sorts of things you can do from opposition. And we've been following up those things very, very, very much. And also with the Black Lives Matter protest, we took a particular position that was very public, that was around following I did most of the media on that, And it was about following the health advice, but not telling people how they should conduct themselves or whether they should go to the rallies. And that was a very deliberate decision taken by the Labor Party.
In relation to systematic racism and kind of how the House of Representatives is dealing with that, how well is the House of Representatives dealing with systematic biases? And then, if not very well, what might be stopping the potential solutions?
That is a very difficult question. And I think that what people need to understand about the House of Representatives is that's where legislation often originates from, and the debate is often within the House of Representatives. Now, in the House of Representatives, the government has the numbers. So whatever they want to push through, they basically can. And even if all the independents vote with Labor, we're still 2 votes short, only 2 votes short. So that's a fairly interesting and powerful position to be in. And all I can't speak on behalf of the government, but what I can say from a Labor perspective is that within Shadow Cabinet, every piece of legislation that comes through, it's examined for things like, and this is exactly what you're talking about, things like, is this going to disproportionately affect Aboriginal people? You know, things like funding and different laws. But it needs to be understood that most of the laws around criminal justice are actually formulated and dealt with at the state level. The state runs the courts, the state runs the police force, the state runs the juvenile justice and the prison systems. But what we can do federally is still fairly powerful, and it's by way of things like closing the gap. It's by way of things like native title law, taxation law, funding arrangements in a very big way, and also urging the states to take particular views on things. Most importantly, it's the federal government that's got the main responsibility for not only closing the gap, but also the implementation of the Uluru Statement. Now, the federal government, the Morrison government, has completely walked away from Uluru, but the Labor Party is supporting the 3 elements of Uluru, which is, in my view, very important to establishing a First Nations voice to the Parliament, which in turn is extremely powerful.
Prior to today's interview, conducted an interview with 8 individuals involved in multiple organs of the criminal justice system, including the courts, police, prisons, and non-government organisations. So we asked the individuals what they perceive as a solution or next steps to achieving a less racially discriminatory system. So for them, they had mentioned concepts such as justice reinvestment, community re-entry programs, and prison abolition as potential solutions. So from kind of a policymaker perspective, do you think these solutions are appropriately feasible to kind of addressing systematic biases in Australia, or what do you think would be an appropriate alternative?
Oh, I think all the things that you've mentioned are very important. I can't see prison abolition ever happening because it is so popular at the state level, tough on crime solutions. So I don't think that's realistic. But justice reinvestment is, and it makes sense, and it empowers local communities. Community re-entry programs are really important, but I think there's also some really fundamental things that are not there that perhaps should be there. In my view, it would be extremely worthwhile for states and territories to examine their bail laws to see whether they, in fact, maybe have some of that unconscious bias that you were talking about earlier. And do the present bail laws mean that more Black kids are getting locked up, for example? Plus, what sort of cultural awareness training is happening for very senior levels of the police force, very senior levels of things like, you know, the criminal justice system. So that's a really important aspect of what we're talking about here as well.
I just kind of want to get your input, something that you could say to potential future Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who want to go into Parliament and kind of make a change.
So I think what's really important is there are many ways you can be involved in the political process. You don't have to be a member of Parliament. Members of Parliament have staff who have enormous influence and enormously important to the way in which a member of Parliament thinks, the way in which you analyse legislation, the way in which you formulate policy. So policy advisors, media advisors, chiefs of staff, administration is so important to the good functioning of Parliament. So don't think that the only thing that you can be is a member of Parliament. There are lots of other ways in which you can be part of the political process, and that's really, really important. I think the other thing is to recognise that it's really hard work. It's not what you just see on the news every night. There's the work that you do in your local electorate, which is where I am today. I mean, there are lots of really interesting things you do at the local level to support the community that has put their trust in you. And every single day you remind yourself that tens of thousands of people are relying on you to take into the Parliament their beliefs, their aspirations, their loves, their pains, their issues. So that's a very big responsibility. It's awesome, the way that awesome is, not just good, but it's really important that you remember that as a member of Parliament. I think the other work that you do as a shadow minister or a minister requires incredible commitment, and you've got to find a balance between that and having a life and work out what your priorities are. Get to know yourself and realise that you're only good to everybody if you're good for yourself. So you try and look after your health, you look after your reputation, and it is an extremely rewarding, worthwhile thing to do, but it does come with sacrifices.
Thank you. So I think that's the end of the formal interview. Thank you very much for kind of joining.
My pleasure. I hope that's been helpful.
It definitely has.
Thanks so much, and all the very best.
Thank you to you too.